the Biden administration, through the EPA, is imposing what they're calling tailpipe emission standards, and they're limiting the amount of CO2 that can come out of a tailpipe.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about Biden's coming from your truck. And you're going to discover how Biden is using new mandates to force you to buy an EV. My guest today is Jason Hayes. Jason is a director of energy and environmental policy for the Mackinac Center of Public Policy. Great to have you on the show today, Jason.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I wanted to have you on because obviously you've done a lot of research on this new EPA tailpipe regulation, that's basically going to try to change the auto market. I mean, the EPA, they're kind of like the Biden administration strong arm, right? I mean, I'm in the oil and gas business, and of course, they always try to use the EPA to, hammer you with everything they can in order to push their agenda, even though it may not be, in the Constitution or legal, but seems like they always have ways to try to get around that. So I wanted to kind of get your opinion first on this new tailpipe regulation and how that's going to affect drivers.
Yeah, I guess the short version of it is that the Biden administration, through the EPA, is imposing what they're calling tailpipe emission standards, and they're limiting the amount of CO2 that can come out of a tailpipe per mile traveled. And depending on which table in their report that they published, which table you read, it's either 73 or 87 grams of CO2 per mile traveled. So to give you kind of an idea, most people will go, okay, what does that mean, right? Like nobody has that clear of a picture. But to give you an idea of what that means, probably one of the more efficient, or at least certainly popular, gas hybrid vehicles that's out there right now is the Toyota Prius. That vehicle, if I remember correctly, emits about 155 grams of CO2 per mile traveled. So even some of the most efficient hybrid technologies right now are almost double what the end standard will be in 2032.
Wow.
So if that car can't meet the standard, then you're left with the reality that some other technology is going to have to do it. And so that's why, like in the article that I wrote for the New York Post, I said effectively this is a mandate for electric vehicles, because nothing else is going to be able to do this. And car manufacturers will have to, across their entire fleet, meet this standard. So the Biden administration, in what they're calling their central study, like the central portion, the scenario that they run, the main one that they're expecting, basically it's going to be 56% of vehicles by 2032, new car sales they expect will be electric vehicles. And then another 13% they're saying will be plug-in hybrid electrics. And so they kind of crush those two together and just call them plug-in electric vehicles. So they're saying essentially almost 70% of new car vehicles by 2032 will have to be PEVs.
Wow. I like what you say about that, because obviously, a lot of people, including myself, they see these regulations that are passed and they really don't understand them, and they don't dig into the weeds about, unless somebody like yourself that is researching it all the time. I mean, people don't really realize, the effect and what the cost is going to be on the consumer.
Right. And that's currently right now, that's one of the big issues, because we're talking about in the article, the 5-year cost of ownership. And the numbers that I had from a previous article that I've written it was like over $92,000 for a 5-year cost of ownership, versus for an EV was 92 versus 76,500. Now, some of those numbers have come down a little bit, but basically the trend is still the same. The EVs are much higher than for a 5-year cost of ownership than internal combustion engine vehicles. So the problem then is right now, the people that can afford to purchase an EV tend to be middle-aged males who are university educated, who are making over $100,000 a year, and they're buying the EV as a second or even a third car. So if you're, the standard issue, young family, the mom and dad, or even like a single mom who's living, just at the edge of what they can afford, paying their rent and seeing inflation hit them real hard, you're not going to have, $60,000 to go out and purchase a new EV. Even the cheaper EVs, they're 35 or 40,000, you're still not going to be able to afford that. And then if you somehow manage to afford it, a lot of those people are living in multifamily housing, like apartment buildings and that kind of thing. And so charging infrastructure is going to be a real challenge for them.
I think you got to have what 220 volt electrical just to charge one of them, in a reasonable
Yeah,
amount of time. And not every
right.
multifamily, you know, obviously house is going to be able to, to provide that.
Yeah, exactly. And even like existing homes, if you're in a single family, like your standard issue 2,100, 2,500 square foot home, a lot of those homes were built back in the 60s or the 70s when the feed coming into the house is not sufficient to handle both the house and an EV charger as well. So you're going to have to actually get your utility to come out and upgrade the feed going into your house. You're going to have to rewire, a portion of your breaker box and that kind of thing. There's a lot of expenses that are associated with this transition that a lot of the time people don't think of. They just think, well, I'm going green and it's going to be okay. But there's more to it than just switching cars. You don't just trade one in and get a new one and everything's the same. So there's a lot of challenges associated with the transition that a lot of people are not aware of.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, we've all probably done that, right? We bought something and then when we get it home, we say, oh God, I forgot that I've got to have this in order to make it work.
Right,
Or, same with EVs. I know you had done some
right.
research on insurance for electric vehicles and wanted to
Mhm.
kind of get your thoughts on that because that's something that people don't really realize either is the cost of insurance to insure one of these products.
Right. There's a couple different things there. Like it was I think it was about 6 months ago, GM was saying for their Chevy Bolts that they had a battery issue. And so for a little while they were like recommending that people didn't park their cars in their garage and don't charge your car in your garage. So you could have home insurance impacts because, well, is this EV going to start a fire in my garage? Or, like, am I going to have problems there? Is that going to impact your homeowner's insurance or your renter's insurance? And then the next thing is what happens if you get into an accident? And there's kind of two things there. There was about 2 or 3 months ago, there was reports of one of the first accidents that a Tesla Cybertruck had, and it had an impact with a Toyota Corolla. And if you looked at the end result of that accident, it was striking because the Tesla Cybertruck, because of the size of its battery, and it's a big vehicle anyway, it weighs, I went through and looked at it, and basically it weighs almost twice as much as like a Ford F-150. Like they're substantial
Wow.
vehicles because the battery is so heavy.
Mhm.
And then if you're in a little car like a Corolla and you run into something like that, you are going to lose because the bigger car is going to win. It's like hitting a big 5-ton truck or something like that. So in that case, that's what happened. They ran into each other and the Corolla was just destroyed. Like it was
Wow.
completely written off. So if you're having those kind of impacts, then you're going to have insurance impacts there because you're writing off smaller cars when they get into an accident with a much heavier EV. But then at the same time, the next part of that is the EV might also be written off because they're finding that if you even scratch one of these batteries, depending on the vehicle that it's in, even a scratch on the battery can write the battery off. And so they had a story from Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, where somebody had a Hyundai Ioniq, one of the new Hyundais, and they literally just did a scratch on the cover on the battery. And so ICBC is the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia, just basically said, we're going to write that car off because the whole car, to buy the car new, was around 51,000 Canadian, but to replace the battery was 60,000. So it was more than the entire car. And so when they started telling that story, they were like, no, 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 that's a one-off. It's not actually going to happen in every case. But just like a few weeks later, there was somebody in Hamilton, Ontario, who had a similar story. They went and they looked, and I actually looked on the website of the Hyundai dealer, and they had for sale the battery pack for a Hyundai Ioniq was 54,000 Canadian. So again, you're buying the car. The starting price is 51,000 Canadian. The price just for the battery is 54. So you're just like, this is insane. You cannot help but have massive impacts on insurance if you scratch the battery and have to write off the EV. And at the same time, when you get in an accident, the EV is so heavy, it's just demolishing the other cars.
That's
So,
amazing. I was at a conference and I was talking to a gentleman that ran a salvage yard, and he was telling
mhm.
me that those EV batteries, they can only get $800 for them once they junk the car, so
Yeah.
they're really not worth anything, as far as that. And I don't think you can reuse them, in another vehicle. So he says you can only, get $800 per battery.
Yeah, for right now, and that may switch because as you start dealing with these other safety issues, once a battery's been damaged or potentially crushed in a wrecking yard or something like that, then it could literally become a hazard, and then you're not getting paid for it. You're having to pay someone to take it. So there's that aspect of it. But yeah, I've heard stories of wrecking yards. There was a wrecking yard in California where they brought in an EV that had been in an accident, and it started to self combust, the self
Right.
ignition. And they literally had to dig a pit, like a hole in the ground, and fill it full of water and push the EV into it to finally put the car out.
Jeez.
And so that when those batteries are burning with the lithium, the chemical reaction actually produces oxygen and it can self start the fire. So it's much, much more difficult to put it out than what you see with an internal combustion engine vehicle.
And I can imagine right now, there's a small number of them on the road, but once you get 40 to 50% of the vehicles out there running on electric batteries, I mean, the disposal for those batteries are going to be, they're probably going to be astronomical.
Yeah, and I mean, eventually, sure, if we continue to mandate these switches, eventually we'll figure out how to do it. And I'm sure eventually somebody will figure out, here's the best and the cheapest way to recycle. Like we did the same thing, 100 years ago with internal combustion engine vehicles, like because they were saying the same sort of thing. Why would you ever switch to one of those loud, noisy things when you could use a reliable horse? Kind of like we've gone through those transitions, but the funny part of going through those transitions is EVs were developed back at the same time. So back in the 1800s, there were electric vehicles. As far back, I think the first one I read in one story, the first electric vehicle came out in like 1839 or something like that. So EVs have already had a chance to break into the market, and they didn't because gasoline or diesel was a much more useful, energy dense, easy to transport fuel. It was easier to deal with all of these issues. You had better mileage, it weighed less. There's just so many benefits to going in this direction that, we're working on the technology, but it's just not there yet.
So when Biden comes out and says that, 70% of all the car sales must be EVs by 2032, is this even realistic?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think it's wildly optimistic, and we'll see this because I'm forgetting the exact percentages. I think all new car sales last year, EVs made up around 7.5%, something like that. In the previous year, it was around 5. So we're expecting that in it's 2024, so in the next 8 years, we're going to be able to go from 7% to 70%. And recognizing that right now we're having all the supply chain issues, everything like that. Where are we sourcing these materials? Are we getting them? Are we relying on China for the rare earth minerals that we need to produce these cars? These cars use, if you leave out aluminum and steel, these cars use 6 times more metals and minerals than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So if you're looking at copper, rare earth minerals, selenium, that kind of stuff, 6 times more. So where are we getting this stuff from? There's just huge supply chain and cost issues that really have not been dealt with. Like I said, the markets are trying to figure this out and they're trying to find a way to make this happen. But the reality is that we just government mandates coming and saying you are going to do this and you're going to do it in the next 8 years is just wildly optimistic and perhaps a bit naive.
Well, that's my opinion. I mean, from talking with other people, I mean, I don't even know if there's enough material out there to have 70% of the vehicles be, electric, and not to count all of the fossil fuels that you're going to need to mine these minerals. I know in this
Exactly.
EPA standard, they're talking about now they're going to come after your trucks. Well, that's here in Texas, it's like coming after your guns, right? I mean, obviously, you come after
Right.
people's pickup trucks, now there is a problem.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we're looking at reports of how this technology is working. You read about range anxiety, people trying to do long range trips. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal from somebody trying to drive from Chicago to New Orleans and then back. And they spent more time charging than they did sleeping during the drive. So you're just spending an inordinate amount of time doing that. But if you look at other things, like we're going to transition our shipping and logistics routes, like we're going to transition that over. There was a story of a driver in California who normally drove a diesel uh, big rig to ship products all over California and Los Angeles, where he was working. And he said normally in a day, he would do 6 runs from his depot, drop off a load, come back, pick up another one. He could do 6 runs. But when he was driving an EV truck, he could only do 2 because the rest of the time he spent sitting at charging stations. And so you're like, immediately you're taking like a 60% hit on your ability to ship products. Like there's no way that that doesn't impact prices. And when we're already dealing with inflationary issues causing, pick your favorite thing that you like to buy at some store, food, clothes, whatever, all the prices for everything are already up right now because of inflation. So now we're going to add, half or more additional cost just because of the inefficiencies of using EV trucks to transport all of these goods. Like this is going to get expensive and we're going to see shortages.
So when you look at a lot of these car dealers, I mean, obviously not the car dealers, but manufacturers, and you look at the way they kind of embrace this government push. I mean, when has these automakers become so reliant on the U.S. government that they're going to lose money to try to push some crazy mandate?
Yeah, and they are losing money because reports from Ford and GM, like Ford was saying they're losing as much as 50 to $60,000 per car. So I mean the numbers are just astronomical. But I mean honestly, I think at least some of this has to be tied back to 2008 when the big bailouts came and GM and Stellantis got a bunch of government money and they were too big to fail. So the government
Yeah.
had to step in. And I'm pretty sure that some of it, I mean, I don't sit in the back rooms with the senior executive of these companies. So I'm only guessing, but I mean, that certainly seems to have been a time when they were, they became far more willing to consider these kind of things. You see a lot more of it happening after 2008.
So is there a way to kind of meet this Biden agenda about EVs without benefiting China? I mean, obviously, I know China is supposedly building a lot of car dealerships, not dealerships, but auto manufacturers along in Mexico that they're going to
Yeah.
try to push EVs into the U.S. I mean, is that something that is going to happen?
I know there's two big companies, BYD and CATL are the two big Chinese EV manufacturers. And so they are definitely flooding the European markets right now. They're able to price lower because of like for a variety of reasons. And if you look on, like federal government sites, you can see that there's concerns from even within the Biden administration about the Chinese businesses stealing intellectual property. So they've taken some of Tesla's charging technologies and then other technologies that they have been like the Biden administration called it egregious. That was the word that was in one of their news press releases that the egregious theft of intellectual property. They're also, if you're familiar with the Uyghurs, there's 2 to 3 million people in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in that region, the Xinjiang region of China that have been put into what the Chinese government kind of euphemistically calls education facilities or education camps, but there's problems with forced labor like these the Uyghur minority, the people are being forced to produce battery components and solar energy and stuff like that. So there's troubles with forced labor in the battery side of EVs. The Chinese government also very heavily subsidizes the production of EVs. So if the Chinese government is paying for it, then I mean you can imagine where it's easy for those car dealers, state-owned or state-managed car dealers, to sell their products for less than other companies who are trying to compete in a free market. So there's a whole host of reasons why these Chinese EVs are flooding European markets. And like you said, they're looking at setting up manufacturing facilities in Mexico or wherever. But they definitely have their eyes on becoming the main suppliers of world auto markets.
So when stuff like that happens, obviously, and now you've got the auto unions coming out to support the the EPA rules, and they've recently endorsed Biden. I mean, why did they do that?
Um, Again, I wasn't in the meeting, so I'm not 100% sure. But I mean, if you look at it, I mean, Biden certainly sells himself as being pro-union, and I know that I'm sure that the leadership of the UAW has made sure that they're taken care of. I know that often happened. I used to work union jobs back, many, many years ago when I was young. And I saw a lot of that in the unions that I was a member of. The senior union staffers were comfortable regardless of what happened to the workers. So I think some of that could be happening, but I mean, also I think that they were able to make sure they protected some of their workers, and so they called that a win. I think they may have seen that if the government continues to mandate these electric vehicles, there's no escaping that it takes fewer workers to build these cars because there's just less to do. So I think they may have just said, look, we'll protect some of our workers and we'll just call that good. And the rest, I mean, you're seeing even just last week, there was stories about Stellantis laying off engineers. Now, they were non-union engineers, but when you start reading all the different news reports after the UAW signed their contracts, Ford said that they were seriously considering moving their production facilities to another area like Mexico or something like that. Whereas Ford has been, pretty dogged in their insistence that they were going to stay in the United States. They were going to manufacture their cars in the United States. Well, after they signed this latest UAW agreement, they said, well, we may have to reconsider that. So I think in some ways the unions, they won a battle last summer, but they may have set themselves up to lose the war.
So what happens if Trump gets elected? Now we've gone down this path of EVs, and of course, he's vowed to turn that around, which may be the best thing to do, obviously, because from what you're saying is I really don't see, how we're going to do this efficiently or economically. And all I see is going to cost the taxpayers in the end a lot more money, either having to bail out the auto dealerships for pushing this agenda, or as you were just talking about, a lot of the unions, I'm sure they're going to get some kind of bailout as well from them losing money. And
Mhm.
and now, we're going to completely go a different direction. And
Right.
so how does that affect the taxpayer?
Yeah, and I think from what I've heard Mr. Trump saying is that he has basically said he was going to stop this whole thing. He was going to, put an end to the EV mandates. Now, when you're going through the regulatory change, there's, you would have to resubmit rules and go through
Right.
the public hearings and the public comment periods and do all of that sort of thing. Otherwise, they could shut down new rules under the Congressional Review Act. There's a lot of details that would have to be dealt with to be able to just stop a rule like this. It would take a lot of work, but clearly he has signaled that that's what he wants to do. So, I mean, I think if obviously, I think the best thing to do would be to just kind of pump the brakes on some of this stuff because the internal combustion engine vehicles that we're producing are extremely efficient. If you talk to the engineers who work in the auto industry, the manufacturing industry, the guys who, or the people that were doing this over the past several decades will tell you, yeah, the cars that we're producing today, the internal combustion engine cars, are, orders of magnitude more clean and efficient than they were in the 50s, 60s, 70s. That the amount of pollution that's coming out of the tailpipe of a contemporary internal combustion engine vehicle is far, far less. And so if you even add in things like hybrids on top of that, you can get extremely efficient cars that are still reliable and they're very clean. They get good gas mileage. I mean, the hybrids, like I was saying, the Prius, I think that gets around 55 or 57.
Yeah.
It's something like that miles per gallon. So extremely fuel efficient. And we could get a lot of the fuel efficiency benefits, the air improvement, the air quality improvements that are being sought by just pumping the brakes on the big transition to EVs and saying, let's just use hybrids because the hybrid technology, we know it works. At the same time, it still relies on existing infrastructure for gasoline and that sort of stuff. We get better gas mileage. We have cleaner air. We still have reliable cars. We don't have to worry about range anxiety because, I mean, lots of times when I've driven rental cars, when I'm out speaking at engagements or something like that, I'll get a plug-in hybrid electric. Okay, well, I can watch the battery on that thing, the gauge kind of go down to 0 miles left on the battery, and I could still keep driving because there's gas in the tank. So you can, in short distances, get the air quality benefits that we hear a lot about from driving electrics, but you still get what you want from a car, which is most people, if they buy a car, they want a car that fits them and their family, that gets them where they're going without having to sit at a charger for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, gets them there reliably, and they can fit their stuff in it and they can afford the payments on it. So if you could do that with a hybrid and get all the fuel efficiency benefits, why wouldn't we do that when, also there's other factors, like I was talking about supply chains earlier. You can build 8 or 10 hybrids with the same amount of metals and minerals that you need to build one battery electric vehicle. So the hybrids, like I said, just let's pump the brakes on this massive transition and go part way if we're really worried about, we have to use electrics. Okay, well, let's keep using the real efficient internal combustion engine vehicles and build more hybrids, and we can get most of the benefits that we want without a lot of the problems.
No, I agree with you 100%. I think that hybrids are the way to go. And also, if people want to buy EVs, they should be able to buy them. I mean, that's
Yeah,
their
exactly.
choice. And if people
Right.
want to buy combustion engines, they should be able to buy, what suits them and what suits their needs. And
Right.
I think that I agree with you that 100%. So anyway, thank you for coming on the show today, Jason. I know that you did quite a bit of work on, the grid, and I'd love to have you back in the future to kind of talk about that on a separate show. And
Yeah,
again, I
that'd be
thought this
good.
was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.